Okay, everyone, welcome. My name is Jeff Pojanowski. I'm on the faculty at the law school, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce John Waters. John Waters, who's best known as a newspaper columnist and author, was born in County Roscommon in the west of Ireland, where he grew up in the town of Castlereagh. His first book, Jiving at the Crossroads, about the cultural underbelly of Irish politics, became a massive bestseller and was reissued in 2012. His most recent published book is Was It For This? Why Ireland Lost the Plot. His other publications include Race of Angels, a study of the roots of U2's music in Irish history and culture. He has written 2 books about the religious and spiritual imagination of modern Ireland, such as it is, entitled Lapse Agnostic and Beyond Consolation, on how we became too clever for our God and our own good. He's currently completing a 3rd book in this series for Bloomsbury Publishing, provisionally entitled Men Without Chests, as well as the 2nd edition of his satirical Thecker's series for Constable. His award-winning plays include Long Black Coat and Easter Dews. He's also a songwriter and a secret musician. He has a daughter and oscillates between Dublin and Lislarry in County Sligo, close to where his father was born in what is nowadays known as Yates Country. Late night last night. Without further ado, John Waters will speak for approximately 1 hour, and then we'll have time for questions.
Thank you very much. Very shortly after I was invited to come here and speak about this on this topic, I actually got the opportunity to do some really relevant field research, because I was invited by the Meeting of Rimini in Italy to construct an exhibition, curate an exhibition on poverty in South America and Africa, in areas which were there were projects by AFSI, an Italian charity, and so that's kind of, I suppose, the main thing I want to talk about today, but also some other things if we have time. I suppose I want to poverty is for me kind of personal, in as far as I think it's personal for us all, because either we're born rich or born poor, or we always have a relationship with poverty, whether it's an intimate one or not. And I think increasingly in the modern world, our relationship is one which those of us who are fortunate in life tend to have a relationship with poverty which is based on guilt, which is not that healthy, and it's something I'd like to talk about later on as well. As Jeff said, I grew up in the west of Ireland. I grew up in a small town, and there were 6 of us in our family, and we lived in a house which effectively had two functional rooms, one upstairs and one downstairs, and the downstairs was for living in, the upstairs for sleeping in, and we didn't have a bathroom, we didn't have running water, we didn't have electricity, we didn't have lots of stuff, TV, radio, anything like that. But the strange thing was, I never thought of myself as poor in those days, and I wouldn't subsequently claim to have been poor. It's not a word I would use about myself or about my family, which is an interesting thing, and I don't mean that in any ideological sense. It's just literally the way I felt about it. I'm interested myself in exploring why that is, and I'm not entirely sure, because there are many factors, I think, which might contribute to that, the kind of culture into which I was born and so on. I think of it as kind of a after James Hackman's predistribution, I was thinking pre-material might be a good phrase for that, because it was a society in which the kind of worth of people was more measured by their kind of values and virtues, by morality and by certain sense of respectability and hard work, those kind of criteria. Of course, money had its role, but nevertheless, you had a kind of a freedom from that, because there were other criteria of measurement. That was one thing. That's not to say that I didn't have a certain experience of being different. One of the big things I remember as a child, it's not a very, there are many aspects to it. There's a certain shame with certain aspects of not having bathrooms and so on, you can imagine. But the one that's kind of slightly whimsical from my point of view looking back was that we didn't have a TV, and that was my biggest problem going to school, because the only thing people talked about at school was what was on TV last night, and usually it was Batman. And so up to until I was about 35 or 40, I actually never saw an episode of Batman, which used to apparently be on every night. at that time. I was absolutely determined that nobody would learn that we didn't have a TV. So I would just listen carefully before the school started, to what people were talking about, to hear the catchphrases, what happened last night. And by the lunchtime break, I would have everything completely off, and I would engage with the conversation fully as if I'd seen everything, and nobody ever caught me out. And so I kind of, there's a serious point behind that, because the definition of poverty used to be an absolute criterion. That you essential needs were met. If your essential needs were not met, you were poor. Nowadays, we tend to define it in Western societies anyway, more in terms of a comparative, equality. This concept of equality, which I'm somewhat suspicious of. Again, I hope not in an ideological way. I just think that it's a problematic concept, and I'll come back to that in a while. But I think among the factors that were really, I think, important in my childhood was that my father was quite eccentric, and even though we didn't have a lot of money, he had lots of books in the house. He had in Ireland, it was a fairly frequent phenomenon where the landed gentry, who had basically come over from England to occupy our territory, would give up and go home, or leave anyway, and they would sell up everything. And my father would be one of those people who would go to the auction, and he would buy all their books and bring them back home and put them in the back room. He never had time to read them, but as a child I read them, pretty much all of them. And that was a big thing, and that's, to have an access to something like that, to the beauty of the world, the knowledge of the world, is, I think, a vital element of any resistance you would have to what is called poverty in modern culture. Another factor, and I really only much later came to realize how important this factor was the church. The church was central to literally the physical church, more than the institution, more than the community, just the church itself, the building. That, we went to school, you always stopped on the way to school and went in and knelt and said a prayer. That was, and on the way back as well. Even, it's strange to think now, a bunch of boys, we used to go in together, and even though we'd be laughing and horsing around all the way down to school, we would lapse into silence when we arrived in the church, and it sort of equalized us all. It made us, that in this place we were equal. There was no distinctions of any kind between us, and we were surrounded by beauty, a beautiful building, and I think that's very important. That there was this sense of a place which symbolized for us the possibility of the world and the possibility of existence. And I didn't think of that until many years later. I read an interview with an atheist novelist called John McGahern, a great Irish novelist, who was talking about. He said the church was his first book. And I didn't know what exactly he meant at the time, but it makes a lot of sense to me now that the church is a book, it's a place of the imagination. It's the place where your imagination is sort of filled out completely in culture, in modern society, or in that society. It's changing now because there's a very reductive idea of what religion is, which is a different question. But to come to this question of poverty, when we got this brief in the summer last year to go to South America and Africa, it was something that I welcomed personally for lots of reasons, but not least because I have a question. I have a question. What is poverty? In all those circumstances, how do we define poverty? Is it possible to define it? Is it possible to do anything other than feel it if you suffer from it? Is it possible really to look upon it and construct sentences about it? I'm not sure that it is. I think that it is something which is felt existentially and which really cannot be comprehended economically or statistically or sociologically. It is something which it defies comprehension. And really, it is an exclusion which is more than an economic exclusion. It is an exclusion from the human family. It is really a blow that is delivered, maybe historically, a blow that was suffered by a family many generations ago, which has been inherited generation upon generation and felt just as severely by the present generation. I think there's something that we need to think about in those terms. But going back to the journey we went to Quito in Ecuador, we went to Nairobi in Kenya, and we went to Sao Paulo in Brazil. And we were the title of last year's meeting of Remini was To the Ends of the Earth and of Existence, Destiny Does Not Leave Man Alone. And this really flowed from the injunction of Pope Francis to go out to the existential peripheries and to live with the people, to the church, that he would prefer a church which would take risks and go out to the, rather than, and have an accident, as he put it, but rather than actually sit at home being safe. So in a sense, this was a response to that. And inevitably, we went to the places where, to the absolute peripheries in terms of economic circumstances and of poverty there. But we had lots of surprises along the way. For me, I had lots of surprises. I can't really speak for anybody else, because much of what I will say probably comes up in all kinds of analysis. But to actually see it in the lived experience of people, and to hear people talk about it, and to see how it was being resisted and how it was being overcome, I think was a very beautiful thing. So we went first of all to Ecuador, to a place called Pisoli, which is what they call an invasion in Quito. And an invasion being a place where maybe 40 years ago, all people started to come from the countryside and occupy some land which seemed to be unwanted, usually public land, and just pitch tents and guard them with guns and invite their neighbours to come and join them. And gradually they began to build a township, which eventually turns into a concrete town, city, and becomes a city within a city. In a sense, a civilization beginning again in an old, a new civilization beginning again in an old civilization. And that was a really, the common factor that we were sort of investigating was the charism of Don Giussani, which I think some of you will know about. But Don Giussani was a priest from Italy who in the mid-1950s became conscious that really Christianity no longer appeared to be understood in any real way as an event, as an encounter with Christ, that it seemed to have degenerated into something sentimental, something moralistic in culture. And he set about trying to put this to rights and founded an organization which became known as eventually Communion Liberation. And there are many books which he has written, which are available in Italian, a fewer number in English, but some really interesting books. The Religious Sense I would recommend as being the core text to begin with anyway. And there's another book he wrote called The Risk of Education. And really what we were setting out to investigate was this book put into practice. Because this book really is an attempt to actually say, well, what is education, and how do we define education? Because in Ecuador and in Nairobi in particular, Kenya, the system of education I think was profoundly utilitarian, profoundly British, which means that it's essentially about achieving very tangible results in an economic sense, in a social sense. And the Giussani method is completely different to that. It's really to put the person, the student, the child at the very center of the educative process, and to speak to that child's needs, their absolute human needs, their infinite needs, their absolute needs. And I'll come back to that in more practical and I suppose clearer terms later on. But we went first to Quito, and in Quito the projects there were essentially to do with mothers and children, kindergartens, preschool and so on. And we saw groups of mothers would come into the centre, the Don Giussani Centre, and be educated with their children. Their children would just play in the background, but the mothers would sit around and be educated in all kinds of stuff, philosophy and theology and all kinds of stuff. And what struck me was, going back to my childhood, even though I would say that I wasn't poor, I didn't feel poor, I was conscious of poor people around me, or people who considered themselves poor. And it wasn't necessarily measured by an economic yardstick. I mean, many of these people might be better off than us. They would have had televisions. They would know about Batman. But they considered themselves poor, and society considered themselves poor. So I kind of knew what poor people looked like, sounded like, felt like, to be near, to be around. And I'm not being patronizing, I'm just saying that there's a sense of an existential kind of presence, or an awareness that comes up in you when you become aware. There's something called poverty which isn't measurable, as I say, in sociological data or in economics, but there is something that happens to the person. That wound, that blow, changes the person and changes their whole physiognomy. And so, but this is the amazing thing. When I went to Quito and saw these women, and listened to them, watched them, if I'd come there just blind, walked in, and you'd say, who are these people? Guess, who are they? Describe their lives. I would have got it completely wrong. these women, you wouldn't guess they were poor. You wouldn't guess that they had come from a place which was effectively a slum. You wouldn't guess the circumstances of their lives from the way they spoke, from the way they talked to one another, from the life that was in them. And this is really, for me, that was the proof of this method. It's very interesting, we listening to Jim Heckman the other night was really interesting because I agreed with a lot. And a lot of it would have concurred with some of the things I discovered on this trip. But it struck me that actually, in many ways, in economics and in sociology and in social sciences, we're trying to reformulate a language, to find new words to describe old things that we had forgotten, things which are once obvious, things which were axiomatic. So Don Giussani simply, 50, 60 years ago, pointed out that the human person has a subjectivity, an I, which is the core of their being, and that this you need to speak to, this needs to be involved in a relationship with another in order to make it flower. And in a way, that's what we're kind of trying to find new language now through sociology and economics to describe a system which will actually make this happen. But here it was down to relationships. It was down to the one-on-one relationship. First of all, the first women who went there, a woman called Stefania from Italy, who went there and started to meet other women and began to talk to them about Giussani and about what he had said about people, human beings, and about the eye and about all these things. And they would bring in other women and they would speak. And you could see this flowering of all these women and then their children around them. An interesting thing we saw was that, which struck me was that I went away thinking, really, that's very interesting, but I've discovered something that nobody else knew, which was that Giussani's method works really well for women. Because most of the men that we encountered were they knew the stuff, but they didn't seem to be animated in the same way. I mean, I would do an interview with some of the women, and like, my Spanish isn't so good, and I had a translator who would translate after the interview what the woman had said. But I very rarely needed to know, I just said, no, it's okay, I know. She has told us everything. Because of her disposition, the way she was speaking, the way she had gone immediately into the depths of her life. Even with the very primitive Spanish that I have, I could understand that this was happening. The men, it was kind of more like a discourse. They would tell you the theory of it. They would explain how it worked and how it, and I then, being a man, decided I would try and develop a theory about this. And my theory was that it, as I say, worked well for women. But then I went to Nairobi. And amazingly, I found it almost the direct opposite, because there the protagonists were men. A man called Anthony, who was the principal of Little Prince School, a guy called Joachim, who was principal of Cardinal Otunga Secondary School, and there was another man called Cyprian, who we went down in Mutuati, a village about 200 miles down the country. And these guys were extraordinary. And, they again had brought this charism into themselves, understood it within themselves. They had been changed by it. They had been transformed by it. And then they stood before these children. And it's an interesting thing was that the students who seemed to respond most to these men were the boys. Now, I don't say this any more heavily than I'm saying it. I don't know. It's a theory in progress. But it struck me that it actually goes back to what Jim Heckman was talking about the other night, this idea of mentoring, and that the nature of the relationship is crucial, and that the empathy of the relationship is crucial. And I suppose in that context, it would make sense if it worked better female to female and male to male. I'll say no more than that. That's simply a sidebar really on a journey which I hope to go back to at some other point. But really, it was amazing to see some of the boys who were there, who had been, attracted into these places, into these schools. We went to the slum of Kibera, and I can tell you, I don't think there can be a worse place that you could live than Kibera. It's a slum of 1 million people living on the side of a hill on the edge of the city of Nairobi. It is absolutely extraordinary. Mud huts, open drains, open sewers, rubbish all over the streets, people living in single rooms, 4 or 5 people in their single room. Really, you can't imagine it. But those kids went a few hundred yards up the road into the Little Prince School, and it was like an oasis. Because in there they were like little kings and queens. There they had access to something that was as good as, if not better than, any kind of education anybody could have had in the world. And in those places they were treasured, each one, for what they were. And they were looked at in this way that Giussani insisted upon, not in order to be prepared for an economic role or to become, nuts in the system or wheels or cogs. They were trained, they were looked upon as human beings who had a destiny which was infinite, which was eternal. And you could see it in them. They were like literally, particularly as I say the boys there, they were literally jumping at me with passion about life. There was a guy called Ignatius who told me, he was going to be the president of Kenya. He was a 19-year-old boy. He said, and it was impossible for me to say that this is not going to happen. I promise you it is going to happen. Watch the newspapers in about 10, 15 years. And the president of Kenya will be called Ignatius. Because he is so certain of his destiny and so certain of what his life is for. That his life is for something great. So, really we begin to see something here. That here we have an equalization that is extraordinary, that kids can be brought up to the very highest level and beyond it by something that is not an economic intervention, by something that is not about materialism, but something that is actually a relationship based on their eye, a harmony with their eye created in a relationship with another person. This is the core of what we discovered. And now, then we went to Sao Paulo, and we found some really interesting things, because there is under the auspices of ASSI, there is an organisation called CREN, which has been operating there for about 25 years, and their focus is on nutrition. And they also have an academic arm who research and do a lot of work in studying this topic. And before I'd gone there, I would have thought of malnutrition as simply an obvious side effect of extreme poverty. We have seen over the years many pictures of emaciated children in places like Sudan and Biafra before that, and kids, little babies with distended bellies and horrific images. And so, the idea of malnutrition is, I think, certainly in my imagination, was very much wrapped up with that. There we found something really quite different, which I think is probably known in this country as well, in Europe, because I heard one or two of the speakers over the last few days alluding to this, to aspects of this. But I wasn't really aware of this. I didn't really think about it too deeply, I have to be honest. In the research of CREN, it's really extraordinary that they have almost redefined poverty. First of all, they see that malnutrition is probably the most accurate and useful tracker for extreme poverty, for profound poverty. Because not alone does it show that there is something really seriously wrong, but it actually, if you go into it, it begins to explain to you what is the nature of that thing that is wrong. And so we kept stumbling on these very unexpected words in Sao Paulo. Loneliness, for example. Loneliness and poverty. How is poverty to do with loneliness? Isolation. How is it to do with isolation? Amnesia. How is it to do with amnesia? Not the words that I expected to encounter. Neither do I expect to encounter the words like beauty or affection, because that was a phrase they kept using in Sao Paulo. Nutrition is affection. Really a strange concept, but let me explain. But essentially what happens is, and this is really a fascinating thing to see, in Brazil, and in other places as well, but in Brazil, over the last, say, 20, 30, 40 years, what's happened, there would be periodic droughts up the country, and people would start to move down towards the city, to Sao Paulo, and move into the favelas. And that's great. At least they have a place to live. They find a house to live in. They maybe get some work. They get some money. Then they get married. Then they have a child. Everything so far is okay. I mean, they're poor in that sense, but everything's okay. The child is born. The child is breastfeeding. Fine. Everything is going okay. But then at the moment when the moment comes to wean the child, that's when the problems begin to manifest themselves. That's when you see what is the real issue here. Because invariably what happens is that the mother is unable to wean her child correctly, properly. She can't persuade the child to take the right kind of food. The child is used to the breast milk, which is kind of sweet, and so the child won't take vegetables, won't take other things. And the mother doesn't really know what to do. So she gives the child what the child will take. And then she sees the child begin to fade in front of her eyes, to begin to become emaciated, becomes, slowed down in growth in all developmental ways. And she doesn't know what to do, and she feels a sense of self-blame, a sense of guilt and shame about this, but she doesn't know what to do. She thinks it's her fault, but she doesn't know how. And so, why? Because there's nobody. She has completely isolated. At this moment, it becomes clear that she is completely isolated, that she has left her community, her family, all the people she knows, her mother, her grandmother, her aunts, her sisters, are all hundreds of miles away. She's alone, and she doesn't know, because nurturing is not something which is innate to the human person. It's a cultural thing which is transmitted. So she doesn't know what to do. And she's completely isolated and lonely and has nowhere to go. And this is where the lucky mothers who stumble across Kren, they find this affection, nutrition. They find something which is, to the people of Kren, quite simple. And can you imagine this as a parent? I mean, all of us, maybe perhaps some of us have been parents, and we know, I know from my own experience of having a daughter, that there are certain situations which develop and they just terrify you, because you think, this is just my child, has this, whether it's asthma perhaps, or something, wetting the bed perhaps long after the child should have stopped, this kind of thing, which becomes shameful to the parent. It's my fault, I should have done something about this, what do I do? And the sense of helplessness that builds up in people, because the more terrified they become, the less able they are to reach out to somebody. And here, this is where you have this affection, which then is offered by Crane, to say, imagine then the relief of a mother who comes in and says, and that somebody like Gisela who works there says, but it's okay. This is not the end of the world. This is a problem that we can fix. You've come to us in time. It's okay. Imagine the relief of that mother. So this is the beginning of the affection. The beginning, and again, it is rooted in this charism of Giussani, that really to look at the person, to look at their most fundamental needs. It's amazing, actually, that the kind of conversations that these people have with the mothers, with the parents who come into them, are not, how was your journey here? It's like, what do you want from your life? What is the meaning of your life? What do you want for yourself and your child? These are the questions. These are the Giussanian questions. And this is, again, you see, the question of poverty then and its antidote becomes something completely different. Because in a sense, the economic factors, they become distant, historical, and somewhat minor. And I'm not ideologically trying to downplay these. I think that's a different argument, and I think it's one we can have. How do we deal with these two things? Which is, in a sense, what we're talking about, the banishment of somebody, of a family, of a whole people from the human family. And the antidote, how much of that is an economic thing? How much of it, and how might that be implemented? Because I don't think it's straightforward. Many of the attempts which we make in our societies to rectify these things with money clearly don't work. They clearly have failed abysmally, because even though in modern societies, in Europe, in Ireland, we have a very good social welfare system, but the people who are in receipt of social welfare may be equalised in some way economically, but they're not equalised, existentially as human beings, because they are receiving, they are mendicants in the eyes of themselves more than anybody else, but nevertheless in their own eyes. And so, and I've seen in Africa, the countless millions, billions of money that have been spent on trying to assist people in Africa without this insight, without this Giussanian insight, that it is not about the money, it's about the gaze, the one-to-one relationship that is formed and can only be based on a one-to-one relationship. I've had some experience before of being in Africa in different places, and I've seen, the Western aid effort, which just throws money at a problem, and the problem just continues or gets worse. And I have some insights into why that is, because, there was a question earlier about the difference between Europe and America, one of the earlier sessions this morning, about the difference between America and Europe, which would be perceived to have a more communitarian and collective kind of mentality and culture, as opposed to America, which is perceived to be more individualistic. And yet, the point was made, and well made, that America is much more successful at creating community initiatives than in Europe. In my view, this is very simple because there is kind of in Europe been a bureaucratization of compassion, that many of the functions which belong to the culture of Christianity in Europe have been hived off to state forces, to EU forces, to all. And so what you get is a kind of a detachment of the person. So you get a fracturing of relationship. You get a kind of relationships become impossible. It becomes impossible for somebody to look into the eyes. When I heard Pope Francis talk about this first, I thought he was engaging in sentimentalism when he said it's not enough to give money to the person, to the poor person. You have to look into the poor person's eyes. And I thought, that sounds like a nice idea, but wouldn't they prefer the money? But I understand what he means. I understand what he means because, yes, don't not give the money, but actually I do think this is the point, that to stop and actually to speak to that person, and not in a paternalistic way, but to actually say to this person in some way, we are together, we are brother and sister, we are brother and brother, we are not different. This is really, I think, the point that comes right out in Giussani, that this is the poverty. It's to say to somebody, for a society or for another person to say to another, you are different, you are lower. This is really the blow that is felt, and which is handed on from father to daughter, from mother to son, generation upon generation. And this is the nature of poverty. This is the deep, deep nature of poverty. But I've seen how this can go wrong. I was in Uganda a few years ago, and there was a very wonderful project there there was an involvement by an Irish aid organisation called BOHER. BOHER is the Irish word for road, and it literally means the width of a cow. Which is what a road was initially in Ireland, still is actually a lot of roads. The idea is that you give a cow, a heifer, to a family, and out of that they would start to build, to get their milk to feed their family, but also if they have a calf, they can keep the first calf and then they give away the second and so on. So there's a system whereby you can grow as a farming entity, as a family. And at a certain point, they install a biogas unit, which is really beautiful a concept because it works from the dung of the cattle, from the stable. So it ends up in a chamber which creates a gas, methane gas, out of which you can pipe it into your house, and you can have a cooking ring and a light. So this transforms the lives of people in Africa. You can see children who would normally have to go to bed at 6 o'clock when it got dark could stay up and do their homework with the light of this. People were cooking food. So I was watching this, but it was one day, and there's this mentality, in many ways these people are very well intentioned, very good, but there's something that's not quite right about the nature of it. Because in that bureaucratization of compassion, the gaze is missing. The idea which was at the core of the Christian initiative, which was to look on the other person as if it was Christ himself standing in front of you, that has gone. So what you get is a kind of the money, the aid, the help, mechanistically, but not the gaze, not the embrace. I remember this particular episode. BOHER didn't have any projects to show me that they were installing biogas units, but I was fascinated by the idea. So there was another agency which was putting in one, and they took me along to show me the biogas unit being put in. And it was a widow woman who had several children. So I was watching what was happening, and they were mixing concrete, and they had the hole dug and so on. And I noticed something strange. I noticed that the cow byre was quite a bit of a distance away, maybe 20 yards away. And it was on a hill, but they were putting the unit way, way down. So I thought, how is this woman going to get the cow dung from the byre into the unit? Why not make it right by so it can flow directly in? So I was sort of puzzled by this. And I said to the guy from BOHER, can you ask them why they're doing it like this? And he says, yeah, it is strange. I was wondering. And so he went to one of the workmen and says, why are you doing this like this? He says, why not? He says, well, she will have to shovel the dung into a bucket and carry it down 20 yards and put it into the chamber every day. He says, what else has she got to do? And really, I think this is the core, that here you have a sense of the mentality with which the West looks on these people, that they are people who are somehow existentially, anthropologically beneath us. Even though we talk up the idea of compassion and the idea of helping, we don't look at them one-to-one, on an eye level. We don't look into their eyes. And I don't mean look in patronizing or sentimentally because I want to feel better, but look in and say, listen, I don't know what's happened to you. Someone's happened to you, and I want to start putting it right. Not, I can't fix it today, but I'm going to start. I mean it. In my eyes, I'm telling you I mean it. This is the only way we can actually begin the process, I believe, of dealing with these questions. A very interesting thing as well we came across was, which came up again in one of the talks, I can't remember which one, but obesity. Again, I would have thought obesity was very much a first world problem. A problem of excess, a problem of, not knowing what. My mother used to have a saying which I think really sums up the modern world. She wasn't a trained philosopher, but it was pretty good. She used to say, you don't know what to do with yourselves. And I think that's really the world is really in that state now. We have all of these gifts, we have all of these capacities, but we don't know what to do with ourselves. So I would have thought that obesity was a symptom of that. But actually they have obesity in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, in the poorest of families. And they have it actually in some families in which you can actually have an obese child and a malnourished child in the same family, in the same house with the same mother. And the strange thing is, it just shows you, it's an example of how the kind of thinking that we apply to many of these problems through social scientists, through sociology, through pediatricians and child psychologists and so on. There was a particular family which I heard about where there were several children, and two of them were very healthy. There were 4 children. Two were very healthy, and 2 were malnourished. And so there was an investigation of what was the reason for this with the usual child psychiatrists and so on. But they went deeper into the question. And immediately the first impression was, well, it must be obvious. This mother has some problem. She hasn't bonded correctly with these 2 children who are malnourished. She doesn't love them as much as she does the other children. The other children are her favorites. So they did an investigation at Cren. And what they found was really amazing, because they found the direct opposite was true. That the 2 malnourished children were so closely bonded with the mother that they identified with her so strongly that they wouldn't eat in sympathy with her, because they realized that she was actually not eating herself in order to make sure her children were able to eat. So you see many paradoxes in these questions when you start to go into them on the ground, when you actually see and talk to real people involved in this, when it becomes no longer theoretical. And so there are many things I would like to bring out. I think there's to treat the problem requires an approach rooted in understanding the actual experience of the malnourished children and their families. This is one thing I was going to say. This involves developing an understanding of the parents and children as human beings and their deepest needs and their understanding of these, as well as in the manner in which they deal with the reality in which they find themselves. This is called a lived experience, the actual life that becomes one with the person and is understood in a particular way by that person. This involves entering into the subjective perception of the person of his or her own life. The importance of each particular factor in the life of the person depends on the meaning the individual gives to each one of these elements. The meaning is not always readily verbalized by the person, but is always expressed in their lived experience and can be captured by the profession, whether or not it is explicit. There are many factors. I mean, the mothers, what they find there is solitude, the sense of loneliness, impotence, the sense that arises from that sense of isolation, that you're invisible, that you're unimportant, that you don't count. You know, a mother can't get a place in her child for daycare. She has no hope of getting a job. The world presents itself to her as a kind of an unresponsive puzzle. She has no friends, no backup, no community to work with, to give her perspective, to give her help, to just make a phone call for her, whatever it is. So then the next stage is a kind of a fatalism, a despair interest where there's no hope of new possibilities. And so the mother becomes resigned to getting by. And then there's a strange mechanism called veiling, which they've identified. It's kind of a coping mechanism where the mother almost like, or the parent starts to hide the problem from themselves. They start not looking at the child, not seeing the child, as it were, with full eyes open. That they blame themselves, but they in a sense, deny the problem also, because there is nowhere to go. This is the real nature of problem. This is something that cannot be fixed by money. This is something which can only be fixed by an embrace, by somebody who is capable of love and of looking at the other person and really caring for their lives. So we went through this whole experience of the summer and going to all these places. And I wanted to construct an exhibition, but I didn't want it to be preachy. I didn't want it to be a homily. I didn't want it to be a sociological, economic analysis. I wanted to try and present it to somebody who would come and look as a story of these people, different stories threaded together because there was different elements in each place. And ultimately, I wanted to answer a question to myself. Like, if I went to an exhibition like this, what would I want it to say? What would I want of it above all? And I think what I would have wanted was to walk away from that, not just as feeling I had consumed something, that I'd educated myself about something and then I could move on to the next exhibition. But I wanted to actually address something which I sensed, that the word powerlessness, impotence, comes up in that in relation to the mother, the parent, who's faced with these intractable problems. I think there's a kind of a mirroring of that impotence in the West, because we don't know what to do about this problem. And so we run around the place trying to do stuff which by and large doesn't do much good. A lot of the time it's just the alleviation of guilt. We try and sort of buy some peace of mind by throwing some money in a box. And we move on with our lives. And I wanted not to have that kind of response. I didn't want to have a collection box at the door so that people could just drop in a tenner and go about their day. I wanted something else. And what I wanted was what I would have wanted in that was to be told something that, or to have something hinted to me about what I could do myself. What can I do? Now, I went to this project really as a completely naive, with somebody with a whole ragbag of different ideological outlooks on different things: poverty in this category, poverty in that category, wealth, distribution, all these things. But I suppose in my own arrogant way, I thought, well, this problem there must be a solution to this problem that obviously everybody else has missed. And it will only, obviously I will, if I get the opportunity, we'll be able to solve it. So I was looking for some kind of system. I started out literally looking for what are they doing wrong? And the more I went on, the more people I met and the more people I talked to, I realized there is no system. You cannot create a system to alleviate poverty. It's not possible, because a relationship cannot be a system. The only way you can actually do is change people. Change the people who are in a position to help, to help the people who need to be helped to change themselves, to create that kind of equalization. That's the only kind of redistribution that will ever work, I believe, in relation to poverty. It's the redistribution of human qualities, of hope, of empathy. So I wanted to say, really, well, what is it? Now, the question I kept asking people, the educators I met in Nairobi and in Sao Paulo, was, how do you get these people, particularly in Nairobi, because the circumstances there were so extreme, and the children came from such appalling, shocking circumstances, and the risks were so great. We encountered a family whose son had been through this, but had slipped off and had been involved with gangs and had been shot by police. So, there's no guarantees. And yet, the children we saw in Cardinal Tunga School, it was just, like, they were so beautiful, so extraordinary, spirited, and so enthusiastic, and so full of life. And you could see in the way that their teachers looked at them and talked to them. It is not like any school I've ever seen in Europe. And the principal of Cardinal Tunga, a man called Joachim, and I said to him, how do you change these people? And he says, I change myself. And then I go to them, and then they see I am changed. So it's not about intervening. It's not about manipulating. It's about being. It's about being yourself, to realize yourself, and then to stand in front of these people and to begin a process, a conversation, in which they can actually make the same journey. And you make the journey with them. And your journey changes you again. This is the only process that, and this is, I think, looking at this, you can see that it succeeds. But I think that we Christians, there's a very real question that we have to ask ourselves. Because it's strange, it's there. It's there. In Christianity, it's there. The answer has been there all along. Christ. To look really at Christ and say, if what Christ said is true, then he is here in each of us. So it's obvious. It's obvious, there's no problem. But it seems that somehow there has been, in the modern world, there has been some kind of morphing of ideology and Christianity. It seems, because more and more what you get from clerics, from clergy, from priests, is more of a kind of a mix of kind of economic interventionism, compassion, piety, but nothing really tangible that would actually tell you what you can do. Now, what I felt coming away from the exhibition, what I wanted people to feel was there's no system. The only system is a non-system, which is the relationship, that I can be different in front of another person, one other person, not 1,000, not 1,000,000, not 1,000,000,000, just one other person, today, just now, not tomorrow, not next week, just today. That the next relationship that I am called into, which requires me to respond in this way, I will respond as best as I can. And that is everything that I need to know. And that is everything I need to do. I don't need to look at my, standing orders for the bank for different charitable agencies. I don't need to put an extra tenner in the poor box. That would help, but that's not the point. The point is I need to begin to be aware of the necessity to change myself in culture, in reality. And that's what I hoped we would get people. And there's a great liberation in that, because you can walk away thinking, okay, that's something that I can do. That's something I can do. So when I next meet a beggar in the street, I can actually try that out. Now, I don't like preaching. I don't like preachers. And so I want to tell you about myself. My attitude to beggars. I've studied it. It's very interesting. And I don't. If all of you are completely different, then congratulations. But this is how I say when I come off the train in the morning. I'm a bit groggy, a bit sleepy, stuff in my head. So I see maybe 100 yards up the street. I see a street person, their legs stretched out on the street, and a cardboard box beside them. They're sitting by a traffic parking meter. So what do? Even now, even after listening to Pope Francis, even after being to Nairobi, even after being to Keto, all these places, what do? What's my instinct? My instinct is to kind of plan to move gradually in the path and keep being busily preoccupied as I walk past. Take out my mobile phone and look, sort of, see, did it ring? And then I go along another 100 yards and I see another one. And there's a slight change, but not much, not enough for this guy. So, the same thing. But then I notice there's a third one. Something changes in me. And it's as if the effects of the other two have sort of bottled up in me and started to change my mentality in some way. And so the third time, I say, oh yeah, okay. So I throw out €2 into his box. And I go off. Now, does that make me compassionate? Does that make me charitable? No. It means I've actually engaged in an economic transaction with this guy. Because what this guy is actually selling is guilt assuagement. He's kind of, he's the guy, that's his job. His job is there because he knows all these people are going around with really bad consciences about the fact that they can't fix world poverty or they can't fix anything. So he's there to offer you relief for €2, for $2, whatever it is. And you can go about your day. Now it's very cheap, $2, €2, doesn't cost. You have a clear conscience for the day. So this isn't charity. And unfortunately, I think this is the model which more and more we're actually working in the West, where we buy peace of mind And I don't think that even our Christian pastors are actually sufficiently telling us what's wrong with this. You know, this is not the point. Because it's not enough even to, you know, I need to stop and ask this guy who he is. I need to ask him who he is and where he comes from and what he's doing here. And I need to learn to do that in a way that isn't patronizing, isn't paternalistic. I need to do it in a way that's real, that this guy could be me. Because I could be that guy. Because more and more in modern societies, poverty is something that comes and goes with people. It's not something inherited. It's something, you know, I think in Christianity, I don't often hear in Catholic Christian gatherings people suggesting or discussing the idea of having arguments with Jesus. It never happens really, but I would like to have a few arguments with Jesus about some of the stuff that he, not because I think it's wrong, but I would just want a bit of clarification here and there. For example, the camel and the eye of the needle. Now, I just don't think that works anymore for where we are. Why? Because at the time that Jesus was speaking, wealth tended to be inherited, and poverty equally tends to be inherited. And I know that's still a factor in a lot of the places I've been talking about. But nevertheless, in this society, in Europe, that's not quite true. You know, you can actually, we have relatively meritocratic societies where you can, even from starting from nothing, you can become something, you can actually make something of your life. So, to begin with, I mean, I think actually in a certain sense I would say to Jesus, well, actually, in a certain sense you could flip that one over, because in modern society, it's actually harder for the poor guy to get into heaven. Why? Because in our society, the poor guy thinks his salvation resides in getting rich. Whereas the rich guy knows it's not true. He knows it doesn't work. He knows it doesn't deliver the things he needs as a human being. So in a certain sense, we need to rethink that one. And I think that goes to the whole point that what's happened is that we have a form of Christianity, Christian preaching, which is really, I think, moralistic. It makes us feel guilty, but it doesn't really do enough more. It doesn't tell us what to do. Because really, what do we do? You know, I mean, okay, this idea of Jesus saying, sell everything, give it to the poor, and follow me. Now, all of us in this room, we're okay. You know, we have a home to go to. We're going to have dinner tonight. We're comfortable. Compared to people in Keto, Nairobi, Kibera, Sao Paulo, lots of people we met, we're pretty okay. So, here's my question. Do we wait till after the conference to sell everything, give it to the poor, and follow him? Or do we go right now? Unless we can answer this question, I'm not being moralistic, I'm just asking, it's a real question, which I have a real question about. We don't have a way forward. Because where do we draw this line? If we have a life here in America, in Ireland, wherever, we have a house, we have a family, we want to look after them, we feel a sense of responsibility. What do? We can't just give away everything and just abandon my children and go off and become a monk, can I? Would that be a Christian thing to do? I don't know. But I don't get any clarity about that in modern culture. I just get the injunction, do it. But if I do it, apart from the fact that I don't know how to do it, if I did succeed in doing it, and if all of us succeeded in doing it, and if we persuaded all of America to do it, what would happen? We'd all give our money away. Who would we give it to? Somebody else. Now there's another problem. They're rich and we're poor. So they've got to give it back to us. That's solved the problem, hasn't it? It's not a, you know, there's a bit of a paradox. There's a bit of a puzzle. At the heart of this is a real puzzle. How large is the money element? And where does it fit? My sense is it's very small. It's not, you can't fix it with money. I mean, you can't not fix it with money. You can't fix it without money either, but you can't fix it with money. You make it worse with money. You need to bring the other stuff to it, and then bring the money that you need to make the other stuff work. That's where the money's got to go in. The money has got to be to enable the embrace to take place. If you put the money in without the embrace, it's dead money. It does more harm than good. So what do? Well, friends of mine from Ireland, he used to be my science teacher, a man called John Coyne and his wife Mary, wonderful people, rich people. You know, if the camel and the eye of the needle is true, they're screwed. I mean, you know, but they decided when they retired that they wanted to do something. And they were, like me, like lots of you, helpless, powerless, didn't know what to do. Dealing with all this guilt stuff, trying to, how do I live a comfortable life? How do I go to college? How do I build my own life and still obey the injunction of Christ? What do I do? So what they decided to do was they set up their own agency in Malawi to build wells. They call it Wells for Zoe. And they go over there several times a year. They have an operation. They have now a factory. They build pumps. What they found was that and this is something I noticed when I went to Zambia some years ago, extraordinary thing. I mean, part of that whole syndrome of aid, we throw money at problems. An example I came across was that there was a massive factory farm in Zambia, which was being funded by Irish Aid, which is the governmental arm of the aid industry. Because that's another thing that happens, that government takes on the whole responsibility of allocating a proportion of budget, of the annual budget, to foreign aid. And then the political parties argue about whether this should be 0.065 or 0.75, whatever it is. And this becomes the compassionate argument. But it isn't really, nobody knows what happens to this money when it gets there. Nobody knows the actual existential difference between 0.65 and 0.7. They don't know, and they don't really care, because it's all a game. And what you find is that money, generally speaking, is spent in all kinds of ways which are good at, the main criterion is that they have to be good at spending lots of money. They have to be good for getting rid of lots of money in one fell swoop. So there's no real attention to the small operator who's actually capable of maybe engaging in some kind of an embrace with the people. You know, I mean, there was a factory farm in Zambia where it's astonishing. Now, Zambia is quite a fertile country, but there are people who drink what, to my eyes, was indistinguishable from mud. And yet, a mile up the road, there's this factory farm which has geezers going spraying up in the air all day long, and it's been funded by Irish Aid because they give some employment to the people who drink the mud. Is that an embrace? But these people, John and Mary Coyne, they go there and they build wells and they teach people how to grow vegetables. And this is, again, the amnesia is another factor. That again, you find that people have forgotten how to grow stuff, how to cook stuff, how to, make a fish tank, how to make a dam, all these stuff. And John, because he comes from a farming background, brings these skills there and teaches them. But he does it in a way that is kind of, and this is the most important thing, he embraces them, not physically. We're not really good at that stuff in Ireland, we shake hands, but he embraces them with his affection, which is his humor, and he says, come on, let's go. And he talks to them about their lives and what they want, and he doesn't take any nonsense. There's a deal. He doesn't give them anything for nothing. He said, you have to donate, the chief of the village has to donate a piece of land. We'll supply the materials, you have to supply the labor, you have to be there at 7 o'clock in the morning. We come and we help you to build the pump. There's no sentimentality about it. They don't take any money. They spend they spend their own money getting there. They don't allow 1 cent of money that they collect from anybody to be used for personal uses, for anything even to do with getting to the place, to Malawi. Everything goes into the wells and the gardens. And this is their embrace. This is their gesture. Now, that's a radical example. But each of us can do that in a little way tomorrow in our own lives. And if we do it enough, we can change things. Because the only change we can really make is the one in ourselves. And that we do, who knows where that will lead? Who knows who will be changed by meeting us? That's all we can do. So, to come back to this question of the Christian position, which I have a bit of a bugbear about, and I don't want to be critical. I think that there's a mix. For example, there's a lot of talk in a lot of modern preaching about the concept of equality. It just seems to have strayed in there. Well, and again, I don't want this to be an ideological point. It's just simply, to me, it seems obvious to me. Inequality, equality, these concepts, they imply the existence of something the possible attainment of something called equality. I don't think that's possible. I don't think it's possible to make the world equal. I think because it isn't, then the idea of more equal is actually an oxymoron. So, are we serious in offering people who are desperate something that cannot be ever attained? And that's our answer? Because that looks to me like it's something that we just say, that's our excuse for walking away from the problem. Well, I propose a solution and nobody listens, so I'm out of here. I don't need to worry anymore. It's not good enough. My job, my function as a Christian is to be the representative of Christ. One of the things we kept meeting over in Keto in particular was women who had really encountered this, and there would be long breaks in their conversation where they would just break down in tears, telling about how they had changed. And several of them had the similar theme about their children, that they used to hit their children, beat their children. And several of them used the same phrase. Says, it just occurred to me one day, would I hit Christ in the face? That's what I was doing. That's what Christianity is. It's not the... I have a friend who's an atheist, and he works for the Samaritans who help people who are suicidal and so on, and ring in. And he's an atheist. And we have this conversation, and I say, you wouldn't be a Samaritan if Christ hadn't existed. If Christ hadn't come, you wouldn't be a Samaritan. He said, what do you mean? Well, it's just obvious. The only reason that you're doing this is because Christ came and has vivified your being with something greater than you. And he says, yeah, that's probably true. We need to think about this stuff. We're not just pieces of meat walking around the place. And Christ is here. Do we believe it or do we not? And if he's here, something vivifies us now, something makes us now, something generates us now. So that's what we talk, generating beauty. That's why we call the exhibition Generating Beauty. That in the generation of the beauty that I have been given, the optimization of my own being on any given moment, in any given day, that I create the possibility that the next encounter will convey something of this to the other person, whatever their need, whatever their situation. I think I've probably covered most of it. If you want to ask me some questions, I can probably hit all the things I've missed. I wrote all this stuff out, and I don't like reading. I don't see the point of people coming to make speeches and just reading out their stuff, because you might as well just send the stuff. Get someone else to read it. But, so we have a bit more time, I think, for questions. So if you want to ask me anything, please do. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. Don't be shy.
My question is, how do you embrace another person or look at a beggar through the gaze of Christ while protecting yourself? So, like, for instance, like one time I was walking into a church and there was a beggar sitting by the church, and I kind of became frightened and, just protecting myself, didn't want to get too close to him being taken advantage of. But why didn't I just invite him to come to church?
Yeah. I understand the problem, and I wouldn't want to trivialize it. There's always a risk, but everything is a risk. Like I have a daughter called Roisin, who's 18, and without any influence of me, she's actually become very good at this. In fact, sometimes I worry she just gives all her money to people, she's taking it all too literally, but she doesn't, I think she doesn't really, I think somehow the fear is the thing, if you can actually somehow look at the fear and see that as the problem and ask yourself really, is this person really a danger to me? Is this person really a threat to me? Reasonably, and you can, it's really, maybe there's other stuff mixed up with it as well. Again, certainly in the beginning of doing this kind of stuff, there's going to be a lot of sense of, is this really me doing this? Can I do this? Can I make this convincing? Can I carry this off? There's a risk in everything. You can actually get hurt. You can get attacked walking down the street without helping anybody. I think you've probably got a better chance if you're trying to help somebody than if you're just walking down the street. And also, you know, do we believe in God or do we not believe in God? I mean, this is the thing, you know. I mean, I think one of the tricks that modern world plays on us is to tell us that there is a kind of a secular world and a sacred one. But there can't be. If we believe that God made the world, He's making it right now, everything. Skyscrapers, motorways, highways, you know, everything. Cars, us. So if we do His word, if we carry out His word, then we're going to be protected. And I think it's learned. We have something to learn. I have to learn it. I'm in the process. I'm learning it every day. I'm trying to get better. I'm not very good at it. But I do sense that this is the way that we need to look at this problem, because all the other things are not working. And Giussani just told us this stuff 50, 60 years ago. You know, it's not new. You know, we can reinvent it with all kinds of jargon, but it's there. And I think that what I've found is any time I've kind of stepped across that line, it has been, for me, probably a better experience than for the person I was supposedly helping. I got more. I became richer because of that encounter.
You spoke of the need to make relationships possible. How do you approach like Western culture and like this bureaucratization of our relationship with poverty? How do you encourage people to, encounter those they've banished from the human family if they can't largely encounter people that who aren't impoverished, who aren't, excluded from this human family?
Yeah, well, you're right. It is a real issue, but again, I come back. It starts with one. Today I don't have to fix everybody. I only have to fix myself. And I can only start on the road that I'm on with the first person I meet. That's all. So I think that there's a tendency and I do it. I always try and think, okay, I've got an idea. That's a nice idea. Now, how do I make that into an ideology and a system that will work globally tomorrow? No, that's not what it is. That's actually what doesn't work, because that's dehumanized to begin with. It is only the intervention of the human that will work. So it's this small. It's you. It's me. That's how big it is. And that's all we have to think about, one step at a time. Like when you get out of bed in the morning, which foot do you put on the floor first? What do you do next? What do you do next? Do the next right thing. That's the only principle. You can't make a system out of this. If you do, it'll fail.
How can this not become just another initiative? So I wake up in the morning and I say, well, I'm gonna look at myself today. So maybe I'm gonna go read this, and then I'm gonna make an effort to go talk to this person and this and that, and then I'm gonna change myself so that I can subsequently help other people. How, in your experience, how does even this affection for myself not just become an initiative?
Well, it is an initiative in the sense that it is a realization every day of the value, the beauty, and the worth of what you've been given, what I've been given. That because much of my life, I learned this myself in my own way, in a different context some years ago. I'm an alcoholic, so when I stopped drinking, I went to AA and learned to because part of the whole AA ethos is love and service. And the whole point of the service is you do things for other people because that takes you out of yourself. And in doing that, you realize that actually this is okay. Somehow my own problems don't seem so big today. Not because theirs are bigger, but because I get perspective. I see that everybody's got problems. I see that everybody can be helped. So initiative maybe it's kind of a very mechanistic kind of word, but it actually is an initiative. It's actually in the beginning, you do need to remind yourself. That's kind of what prayer is to me. It's to actually get down and ask for help to do it today, so that I can be, make me what you want me to be today. That wouldn't be a bad prayer, I think. And that's all you can do. I mean, And I think the force against that in us is this kind of a skepticism based on the idea of well, sure, I mean, what's that? It's nothing. I mean, what difference will I make? Even if I'm the most perfect person since Christ himself, that won't change much. It'll change everything in the space around you today. And that's all that you can do. No matter what you're doing, if you're writing an article, if you're just working in an office, if you're driving a bus, whatever it is, if you're doing that, that's everything.
Thank you. In your opinion, what is the most effective means to enable the embrace? Is it money, or maybe it's or is it even material at all? So just if you could give your opinion as to what best enables that embrace to happen.
I don't think there's an answer, but I'll give you one. Everything is different. If you don't have any money, you can't give anything, but you can give something else. Maybe there will be a day when you can only give money. Whatever you give, it's got to be unconditional. You can't be calculating. You can't be sort of. There will be elements of calculation in it in the beginning, because it's unnatural in the kind of culture we come from to behave like this. As I said, I don't know exactly where the money thing fits into the big picture. I know that it would be ideological for me to say, and I don't want to say it, that there is no material dimension to poverty. Of course there is. There's a material issue now, and there's back then, wherever the root of the poverty is, it was a material question in the beginning. Undoubtedly, and but it can't be fixed by money now. But still, if you meet a guy in the street, and he needs to buy a sandwich or a coffee, or if that's what he says, that's what he needs. And even if you're going to tell him some jokes and go on your way, I mean, he's not going to be very happy about that. And there was a particular cardinal, I won't tell you who he was, told me a story. About an experience he had in a particular city. A man came up to him and it was a bit rough, street person, and the cardinal said, well, to himself as the guy was coming up, he says, if this guy tells me the truth, I'm going to give him some money. So he said to the guy asked him for money, and he said, well, what do you want the money for? And he says, he looked at me calculatedly and he says, I want to buy a drink. So I gave him the money. There's a wonderful story about Giussani, about the lipstick. I don't know if you heard this story. It's about a student who came to Giussani and said, I don't know, I gave some money to a woman there last week, and I found out afterwards she went and bought a lipstick. She told me she wanted to buy food, and she went and bought a lipstick. And Giussani said, you know nothing. This woman needed the lipstick more than anything else at that moment. She needed the lipstick for her dignity. Who are you to judge what she needs the money for? So there's no straightforward answer. But I think we need to, the money thing is a different question. And I think that we go into something else, which I think was very interesting talk by Gary Anderson the other day about the biblical roots of all this stuff, the eye of the needle and all this stuff. And he hit on this kind of concept of hoarding as being the problem. And I think that's right. And it's very interesting that in economic thinking, that's also the big problem. I mean, that hoarding creates a kind of like, it's kind of a private vice, a private virtue that becomes a public vice because it creates a sclerosis in the economic system. And that's kind of, I think the money thing is, we're terrified of the future. We have a sense of economic security, which, that's why we can't be generous, because we don't really believe. We have to start believing that if we do this stuff, it's going to work. And that doesn't mean we're going to get richer, it just means that everything is going to be okay. So the money becomes whatever the money becomes. If you think this guy needs all your money right now, give it. If he thinks he just needs the price of a coffee, give it. There's no hard and fast rule, but I'm not, that's kind of the problem, is that we're trying to create hard and fast rules by saying we have to give 5% of our income or 50% of our income, We need to begin to find out in new relationships what people need and what works for them. Because ultimately, what's more important than the money is the gaze eye to eye, because that gaze is actually a promise. It's not a sentimentalism, it's looking at that person and saying, I'll be back. I'm not going away. You've made a friend. I will be around. That's the promise, and that's the most important thing, even if you have no money.
There's a couple more questions left, but we are unfortunately out of time. So thank you, John, for speaking with us today.
Thank you.